Pleasure to be here once again. Myself and the Corps Major. I'm Colonel Matt Quare, and Corps Major is Mr. Mark Elliott. We'll take about 20 minutes of your time, but we'll leave some time at the end for Q&A, and that's why we brought it forward slightly. I picked up lots of things yesterday chatting to you all, and it's brilliant to see so many partners here as well. So I'm going to have to modify my presentation slightly, but don't worry about it. I'll just remind you, Corps of Royal Engineers, we are the British Army's military engineers. I would say we're Defence's military engineers because there's no other military engineers in UK. And you will all recognise the cap badge accordingly. I just put up the mission of the Corps headquarters. That's what the Corps headquarters does. And I'll let you read that. But it's a bit in red, the main effort, the lived experience. And that's why being here today with yourselves and ensuring that lived experience continues. Underneath is recruiting and retention, which is absolutely key. We have to continue to recruit, and we've got to continue to retain the people we have. And there are some challenges out there, and I'll allude on that in a second. But it's all about the lived experience, and that's broad. But this type of activity plays a huge part of that lived experience. I do people, I do the workforce, and all I've done here, if you can see it at the back, all I've done is put up our rank structure and what we actually hold in the Corps today. And this is purely regular, I haven't done the reserves. But what you can see, we're actually overmanned, which is a brilliant position to be in. But I'm a realist. COVID has kept our young men and women in the Corps. Obviously, they haven't gone out. But also, some of the threats we currently see are actually helping to hold people in the Corps. So it's a great position to be in. Some of you will notice, if you can read the numbers, we've got a shortage of Lance Corporals, but we've got a surplus of Sappers. So what we've now got to start to do is move our workforce through the rank structure and fill it up all the way up to the top. And therefore, we have a very effective Corps of Royal Engineers. The picture on the reserves is not as rosy because reserve recruiting has suffered during the pandemic. And that is now a bit of a main effort for the Corps to make sure we bring the reserves up. And why am I mentioning the reserves? Why is it so important? I'll explain that when I talk about the future soldier structure, because the Corps is going to change. Your Corps will change in the very near future. This is what future soldier is all about. So an army workforce, regular reserves and civilians, whether that's civil service, contractors, partners, industry, we're going to come, that whole force. And some of you may have heard the words whole force before. We've got to modernise, we've got to transform, we've got to resize and reshape. So the size of the Corps is good, the shape is not quite as good. We still have 26 trades. We may lose some trades as we go forward. But it's all about making sure that the operational effective of the Corps can move forward. And it's all captured in a document, something called a workforce plan, and we know exactly where the peaks and the troughs are, the pinch points, and what we're going to do in the next 2 years, work to make sure the Corps' shape and size is in balance for the future. The good news on here, perhaps not so good, we actually now have over 200 females in the Corps. And that is something we're working really hard to ensure that we have more females. It's about 100 officers, which is 10% of the officer workforce. It's about 100 soldiers, which is 0.1% of the workforce. So it's something we've got to get after, and we do have a campaign plan to make sure we bring the number of females into the Corps, and it grows and grows. The Army has got a very ambitious target set by the government, and again, we will play our part in that, but we're not going to be able to catch up with some of the other cap badges due to the nature of who we are and how we operate. And I think you'll all realise that and understand that. Operationally, what I'm not going to do is, because this has been filmed, I'm not going to put all the operations up there. But what I can assure you now, your Corps is busier now than it was 3.5 years ago. You can see the numbers committed, 23 countries, 10 UK ops, 7 overseas ops. Noting we've got a broad church here, I'll just run through some areas. So 2-3 Parachute Engineer Regiment, currently deployed Iraq. They've got over 140 people in Macedonia, and then they've got various things happening in UK. 4-2, the Geo community, they have people in Estonia, Mali, the Falklands, and again, lots of stuff going on in UK. 2-4 Commando, people in Poland, Somalia, Mali, and then across, effectively, Northern Europe, which speaks for itself given the nature of their role. If I now come to the Armoured Engineers, 2-5 group as we call it, we're currently doing the UN operation in Cyprus, so 234 people there. Then a subunit in Poland, 2 subunits in Estonia, elements in Kosovo, and just under a subunit recently went out to Germany/Poland, all in support of clearly what's happening on NATO's eastern flank. So again, fairly busy, or very busy. Then I come to 8 Engineer Brigade, which effectively makes up the rest of the Corps. People in Brunei, Australia, Mali, Somalia, Kenya, Nigeria, Middle East, the standard air support to the Middle East, the bases there operating, Oman, Pakistan, Cyprus, Macedonia, and again, they've also got a subunit in Germany in support of everything that's happening on the eastern flank. And then given the nature of that group, there's a lot of other things going on in UK, particularly in the EOD and search world, counter-CBRN. And then 170 are infantry specialists. Again, a lot of planning going on in support of the government's current refugee crisis, as in migrants coming across the channel, etc. And they're involved in a lot of work there with the various agencies. And then hidden in the background is the various things in support of special forces. So the Corps is busy. If you're a youngster, it's brilliant. What a brilliant opportunity to be out and about, having joined the Corps, hopefully to travel, but actually do your trade, and people are actually really enjoying it. And the Corps Sergeant Major is going to talk about that shortly. Future soldiers, you won't be able to see that at the back, but in short, the Corps will restructure. Effectively, we continue to support the 1st Division, which is all about operate, and then the 3rd Division, which is all about warfight. Under Future Soldier, we do lose about 700 soldiers. So we lose about 9% of our workforce. But that's in line with the rest of the Army shrinking by 10,000. 16 Air Assault Brigade, 2-3, stay aligned. They will gain a Gurkha squadron into 2-3, so that's good news. 3 Commando, more or less the same, slightly slimmed down, just lose a little bit of fat around the waist. Chief of Staff, British Forces, Gibraltar. And 4-2, absolutely in huge demand, so they do not change. What we do, we lose one of our group headquarters, so we lose 170. It will merge with 12 full support engineer group and become one group. And that's what's shown on this slide here. And they take under command all the works groups, as well as having the full support elements. Retain amphibious capability in Germany. So our only footprint outside UK is in Germany in Sennelager. So that's the kind of like the structure as we move forward. And I can talk about that later individually if people want to know more detail.
How are we doing? Okay? Good, good. Everyone hear me at the back? Fantastic. Well, firstly, thank you very much for your time. It's genuinely great to see everyone together as part of one big family. And that's what we'll talk about now. Corps Sergeant Major, what do I do? Well, I'll explain my role as the scrum half for the Corps. So the Corps Colonel's my out half. He directs where I go on the pitch, and I carry it out for the forwards and the backs. That's how I describe the role as Corps Sergeant Major. And my role fits in to the whole of the Sapper family. We start with the young people, with our cadets, and a lot of activity is done through our Corps engagement team. And Sergeant Smith's here today from a very dedicated bunch who inspire, motivate, and show our young people, the next generation, what they're coming into. talking about our skills through STEM and trade as well. Recruits, every pass-off parade, we'll go and visit. It's a big handshake, and we welcome people into our family, into our team, on the completion of Phase 1 training, and also on the stable belt presentation at Gib Barracks. It's really important we keep that personal touch. And the young people now going through, for recruits, are going through a very, very tough challenge with the physical tests. They're now carrying over 40 kilograms for the combat stuff. Believe me, these young people are better now than probably what we have been over the last 20, 30 years. And they will carry those sword and shields for us when we move on as well. They are a great bunch. Sappers, that's regular and reserve, and we do try and work hard to bring that together, so we are one team. But in that, as I always say, the positive lived experience, a happy Sapper is a good Sapper, but also, my wife Louise is here, a happy wife is a happy life. So it's a very good balance on that as well. But for our Sappers, the best way of motivating is through adventure training and sport. And thankfully, as COVID lifted over the last year, sport is back in the programme and really well supported by all our charities, which is great to see for our young people. Quick plug, the Sappers won the rugby final on Wednesday at Aldershot, beating the REA, so it's all good news for us. Veterans, on my journeys, I try and explain to people what a veteran is. We have our own ideas of, what a veteran. Someone who has served for the few years for Queen and Country, we include as veterans, and that extends out through our REA, our Chelsea pension, which is always great to see and support. But we try and keep connected, more importantly, and learn from the stories from the past, all those lessons learned, so that we don't make the same mistakes in the future. So it's important that we keep those connections moving forward. And finally on here, of course, our family. Every given opportunity, I will always remind people to thank their family and be grateful for them every day. So every morning, I'll get a coffee, I'll take that up to Louise to get her day started, and thank my kids every day, but also to you as families as well, who support soldiers and officers doing the jobs where we are around the world. We are very key that our family is a big part of who we are. That's our Sapper family. And from there, we just hope that we can maintain that through events like this, which is fantastic, but also looking forward to the Sapper Games in July in Catterick, which again will bring everyone together for competition and sport, but also to see each other and socialise. Things like the Army Navy, other parts as well. And it's really important. Looking further out, the Freedom of Medway weekend, the Memorial Day in September. Again, we look forward to seeing everyone who can make it there as well. That's that part on the positive lived experience. The happy Sapper is a good Sapper in soldier speak from me. Happy to take any questions once the Corps Colonel's finished. But I hope you enjoy the rest of the day and, of course, the weekend as well. Thank you.
So just moving on, obviously the Royal Engineers Association is one of the charities, and what I've put up there is the other charities, which I'm sure you're all aware of. And that then does form part of the Sapper family, looking after our people, whether they're the cadets coming in, the trainees, those serving, and then obviously the veterans and families. And what I can say is that network on there, let's call it a network, is working really well. It's getting better and better. The synergy of working together in the big output of making sure the lived experience of people, regardless of who they are, it is a positive one. And again, the charities value about £30 million. The REA in particular has been exceptionally generous to the Corps, the serving Corps in particular recently, and I know that will continue. And we're in a really good financially stable position, given all that's gone on in the world over the last 2-3 years. So it's an exceptionally positive outcome. CPD on the right, that is supporting our youngsters, making sure they are upskilled, they have those qualifications as they go on to their careers, but then their next journeys. The Institution of Royal Engineers, similar approach as well. Obviously, I've mentioned about the REA Association, and then in the middle you have the core funds, the clearing house for all the money, if I'm honest, the Sapper shop below, and I'll just touch on that in a second, and then finally our museum, your museum, which goes from strength to strength. And I just remind you, it is one of 3 designated military museums in the country. Again, like most of the charities, more going online, virtually digital, so it's accessible. So it doesn't necessarily mean you have to come to Chatham to see the museum. And there's a really good program being run by the Army to ensure that the museums, the military museums, are more accessible. So that's effectively the charities supporting. If I just touch on where the REA has supported, REA Museum, this is 2 projects. On the right, the archive project. Some of you remember at Chatham, in the big building, we used to have the library. That's no longer there. It's now actually in the Ravelin building, properly held, humidity control, all of our archives, etc., accessible for anyone. And then on the left, you have what's called the Forbes Gallery. And obviously that was the opening, a brilliant open space where we can have temporary exhibitions to showcase the core. Because what you see in the museum is only a fraction. There's so much behind the scenes. So that's the V1. That's now been changed. We actually have a sports display in there at the moment. So again, supported by the Royal Engineers Association. Wimbish, building athletics track. Of course, Sergeant Major touched on sport. And again, I think £250,000, Ken, top of my head. £250,000 from the REA in concert with other charities, Army Sports Control Board and the local authority to ensure that there's an all-weather athletics track at Wimbish. It's a barracks we're going to retain with 2 regiments in that can be used. So I'm just trying to show you some of the things that do go on if you're not aware. I mentioned the Sapper shop. It's there for everyone online. Please keep signposting people to use it. The shop wants to develop, the shop will grow, and it will react to you, the customers, as you want things. So it is there. Anything profits, I think we turned a £10,000 profit this year, comes back into the core charities, which we can then invest into the Sapper family as a whole, whether it's to allow people to go off on adventurous training or allow people to go and do sport, etc., etc. Of course, Sergeant Major mentioned the sable belts, the parades, the REA now normally in attendance as we're out of COVID, because the REA very kindly took on the stable belt, the cost of the stable belts for every soldier. So that's the early connection for our serving soldiers with the REA, the stable belts and the tactical recognition flashes as an example. Obviously, we're being filmed. It's all about communication, stupid, someone told me. That's why we have Q here. We use all of these platforms. We just got to keep spreading the word of all the good things that the Corps is doing. And again, I know you as the REA are very active on various forums, perhaps some good banter as well. Be careful what I say. But we just go up and up. But it actually makes us visible as a Corps, not just internally, but also externally. And that brings benefits. I have people come to me wanting to sponsor the Corps for events, etc. And that's due to our communications. We've got to compete with everyone else out there in the marketplace. And again, we have 4 people running the Corps Comms Hub, or part of the Corps Comms Hub. And again, I do say, do look at YouTube if you want to find out what's going on. The Corps channel, it's really good. And obviously, not up here is the Sapper magazine as well, which we continue to do hard copies, but also is digitally online if you prefer to have it through a digital reader. Of course, our Major spoke about the Memorial Day. On the right there, that is the unfortunate list of 25 sappers over the 20-year campaign who lost their lives in Afghanistan. And we are going to unveil, or dedicate, sorry, a plaque to those 25 in Rochester Cathedral on the 18th of September. And a stonemason she's just about to set off and start carving. The same stonemason that did the obelisk at the NMA. So you know, really important event in Rochester Cathedral. And again, if you can make it, you know, please do. I think it'll be a very poignant, a very emotional period. We're expecting probably about 20 of the families to come, some coming as far as Canada and the US to be at that event. And that's, as I say, 18th of September. History, customs and traditions, you know, that's why we do what we're doing here in Gibraltar. You know, we must not lose that. We've definitely got to modernise, but we've got to make sure we learn, as a core site major, learn from the past, retain our history, well, acknowledge our history, retain our customs, and make sure our traditions are appropriate. And again, that's something I pay a lot of attention to. And again, your support with that is greatly appreciated. And then my final slide is, obviously, this year is Her Majesty's Platinum Jubilee as our sovereign, but it's also the Platinum Jubilee as our Colonel-in-Chief. That is the cover of a book, which is 95% there, which we will gift to Her Majesty, and effectively it charts her 70 years as our Colonel-in-Chief. And what it will do, reflect in decades what the Corps was doing, so chapter 10 years each chapter, and then also capture in picture, and it's predominantly picture, her visits to the Corps, whether that was to Kinloss, Chatham, Fortwo, dive school, etc. And we've been putting that together effectively for the last 7 months. Subject to Her Majesty's approval, we will then run a limited edition of that book and sell that through the Sapper shop. So that's to acknowledge Her Majesty. Final bit on her Platinum Jubilee, I think it's the first time since the coronation, we will have 54 Sappers and Queen's Gurkha engineers on parade on the Sunday for the Platinum Jubilee pageant, marching. I think we're in the first block, marching up the Mall, around Buckingham Palace, etc., with weapons, clearly, etc., etc. And that's our job next week, drilling and inspecting those happy 54 individuals who have been voluntold. They're all volunteers, they are volunteers. So if you're watching on the Sunday, please do look out for the Sapper family on parade.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Major Fred Kiddy. I am the SO2 infrastructure here at British Forces Gibraltar. And this afternoon, I'm going to take about 15, 20 minutes of your time to just basically go through Sappers on the Rock. So none of you will have escaped the notion that the Corps and its history is intrinsically linked with that of Gibraltar. And I hope to just give you an insight into how the Corps was formed, what we've done throughout Gibraltar's history, and how that all ties in. And then at the end, I'll give a brief teaser into what may be coming in the future as well. Main events I'll look at is going to be the Great Siege in the 1700s, and then we'll look at some of the engineering marvels that occurred here during the Second World War. So taking us all the way back to the start, 1704 is when Gibraltar was conquered by the British. Admiral Rooke sails into the bay and takes it from the Spanish. At this point, we had some very early engineering activity. Captain Joseph Bennett, one of the Queen's engineers, he's part of this expedition, and he comes in and starts immediately repairing all the fortifications and everything like that we destroyed when we took it from the Spanish. The Spanish will promptly try and retake it from us, but Bennett and his team will continuously mend the fortifications throughout the siege, and the British will withstand. Worth noting here that this is actually, I think, the 10th siege that Gibraltar has had. Throughout its history, Gibraltar, giving its geographic strategic importance, has always been a natural fortress, and predominantly fought over between the Spanish and the Moors. In fact, it gets its name. So the first bloke to conquer it, a general called Tariq Zaid, conquers it in 711 and names it Jebel Tariq, the Mount of Tariq, which obviously has morphed over the years to become Gibraltar. So that's how Gibraltar actually gets its name. But what we have is, essentially, we've inherited medieval fortifications. And if you were to look through this wall, you'd see up at the top the Moorish castle. These are great fortifications if you're fighting blokes with swords and shields. Not good when there's 32-pound cannonballs knocking at your door. There will be a subsequent siege in 1727, the Spanish renege on the Treaty of Utrecht that gifts Gibraltar to the British forever and a day, and they try again but fail. But what we have then is probably one of I think the Corps' underrated heroes, Colonel Green, the chap in that small little picture there I put on there. Colonel Green arrives in Gibraltar in 1761. He's an experienced engineer. He's been the chief engineer of Newfoundland in Canada. He's also participated in all the campaigns over there, fought at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham and so on. And he comes in here and immediately recognises that Gibraltar needs a massive infrastructure improvement because the Spanish have pretty much made it their main effort that they want it back. And the British do not want that to happen. Now, infrastructure programs throughout the days and in this modern day as well, he doesn't have the funds or the capacity to actually deliver anything. So he ends up getting on a boat back to the UK, has meetings with all the way up to the king himself, and is eventually granted the funds and comes back and initiates a wide sweeping program of defense upgrades. And in particular, he designs and builds the King's Bastion. This is a fortified bastion that will jut out into the sea, riddled with 32-pounder guns that can fire down the bay, up the bay, across the bay, and it will basically dominate that Bay of Gibraltar from the Spanish and the French navies. But most importantly, he forms the Corps of Military Artificers. This happens in 1772 by royal warrant on March the 6th, 1772. And this is because prior to 1772, he had to rely on artificers that came out of infantry battalions that were stationed here on the rock and also from the local workforce, so the LEC contingent. Now, the artificers from the infantry companies, he never had a steady flow of them. He didn't know exactly, when they came off the boat, he didn't know whether he was going to get a blacksmith or a carpenter. It was never guaranteed what he was going to get. And the LEC workforce, he had a nightmare with them because they weren't under military discipline. If they didn't want to work, they didn't. And sometimes their work was a bit shoddy. So he goes to the governor, General Elliot, who also was an engineer back in his earlier days, and petitions him, can I get a company of artificers under my command that can do military engineering? What they'll also do is fight on the ramparts when necessary. So the soldier, combat engineer, tradesperson is all starting to come together here. Elliot enthusiastically supports this, and like I said, 6th of March, 1772, the genesis of the Corps is formed. And their first major action is going to be in the Great Siege. Now, there's two big events that happen in the Great Siege. I mean, predominantly it is a story of starvation, deprivation, and just grizzing it out for all the men and women involved in that siege. But there are two big actions that happen, the Great Sortie and the Grand Attack. Now, Great Sortie, so General Elliot, he sees the Spanish lines coming closer and closer and closer to essentially the front gate of Gibraltar, and they're going to use their cannons to batter down the defences. Minorca has just fallen to the Spanish, and they're sending thousands of reinforcements over to finally take Gibraltar. And so he thinks, right, we're going to do a sortie, and we're going to wreck their cannons. And so 27th of November, 1781, he issues the order, and 3 large columns of infantry form up on the Red Sands, which, if any of you have been over to the cable car, that's the car park there, and that was the parade square. They all formed up. And the artificers split themselves in between the 3 columns. The idea was the infantry were going to sally out, clear the trenches, and the artificers with specialist tools were going to rip down and burn the Spanish gun emplacements. So they all sallied out through the casemates, through the land ports, and into the Spanish positions. Now, thankfully, the Spanish were pretty much asleep at the wheel, and it was a cracking success. The Spanish gun emplacements that had taken them something along the lines of 16 months to build were burnt down within a night. General Elliot goes out with them. Bit of a risk for the governor to go on a nighttime sortie, but he goes out with them, and he's heard exclaiming, Look, my boys, look how glorious the rock looks by the light of these fires. You know, it was a very glorious time indeed, and essentially we set the Spanish assault back by a number of years. So the Spanish, and now with some French assistance, come for a different angle, and they do what is known as the Grand Attack. So they got an architect, Jean-Claude Darcon, and he devises these floating batteries, which are going to be impregnable to the fortress's cannon. And for a time they were, so they sail up and they engage Colonel Green's King's Bastion. They engage that, and for a while, our cannon shells are just bouncing off the end, off these floating batteries. What happens then is the artificers start superheating the cannonballs till they're red hot, and they're firing them out over the bay. They get lodged in the batteries, and they all burn. And it is a stunning defeat for the French and the Spanish. And that essentially ends their ambitions of conquering Gibraltar. There will be a few more months of, again, a bit more starvation and deprivation, but as essentially that, and they will no longer have any serious attempt to take back Gibraltar. So moving swiftly on, throughout the days of empire, there was a lot of engineering work, and the Royal Engineers are key in all of that. But we'll fast forward slightly, and we'll get to the Second World War. And so immediately after the outbreak of World War II, here on Gibraltar, there's two fortress companies, and they're pretty much half-manned, and realistically, the Sappers here were mainly engaged in operating searchlights. They did do a bit of construction here and there, but they're mainly engaged in the searchlights companies. Now, after France falls, the situation changes. Britain is very worried that fascist Spain is going to allow Adolf Hitler to stage an attack from Spain into Gibraltar. And in fact, Operation Felix was the code name for that, but they never got around to doing it. But during this time, the two fortress companies, they're brought up to war strength, and also Gibraltar is then reinforced rapidly with 6 further companies of Royal Engineers. 4 of those companies are tunnelling companies, so it gives you a little hint of what was to come. And here we are, there's 2 major engineering projects that happen throughout this time: the tunnels and the construction of the airstrip. I'll just go into each of them in a bit more detail. So the tunnels, and in my opinion, these are probably the finest bit of engineering the Corps has done, certainly in the Second World War. But I know that glory tends to go to the Mulberry Harbours, but these are a significant engineering achievement done by the Corps, and it was planned and executed entirely by Sappers. Unfortunately for these chaps here, before 1942, there was a bit of a lack of plant, so a lot of it was dug out by hand, and the rock and the rubble removed by hand, so a hard graft, no doubt. But what they do is they form a whole network of tunnels within there. And we start to see images like this one here on the left of men operating out of the HQs in accommodation within the rock. And they're all in Nissan huts, because essentially within the rock, the tunnels can get up to a humidity of upwards of 98%. And so anything in there is going to rot or rust. So they had to start putting air gaps in to be able to keep stores and men in a relatively comfortable situation. So the whole area gets kitted out with Nissan huts. Post-1942, we get a whole load of additional equipment, compressors, plants, everything like that, which allows us to really ramp up the scale of the tunnelling that we do. The Great North Road on the right-hand side there is one of the key examples, a tunnel big enough to drive a 4-ton truck down that goes from one end of the rock to the other. It is a sizable achievement. And this map here, you probably can't see it at the back, but it just gives a vague indication of the amount of tunnelling that went on. During World War II, there was approximately 1.1 million cubic yards of rock removed from the inside of the tunnel, which, give a bit of scale, that's like having a London Underground tunnel built from London all the way to Liverpool. So that is the amount of mileage that they put into the rock in terms of excavations. The other great bit of engineering that we did during the Second World War was the creation of the airstrip. So prior to the war starting, it was a racecourse and a bit of grazing land for what little cattle we had. So once the war was declared, it was decided we absolutely need an airstrip here. So initially, they just built it over the Sandy Isthmus to the north. So it's about 900 yards long, which, yeah, that's all right. After a couple of months, though, either side is littered with the wreckage of planes that either didn't take off quick enough or didn't land quick enough. And it becomes known as a pretty nasty place to land your plane, and not the pilot's favorite, especially when you factor in wind eddies, which not being an airman, I don't know much about, but apparently it's pretty nasty. And so the decision is made to then extend the runway out into the sea. Originally 1,500 yards, but even then that's deemed too short, so they go out to 1,800 yards. And this is, again, executed entirely by the Corps. We have a number of extra Sapper companies turn up. So at this point, Gibraltar is bulging at the seams, and there's about 15 companies worth of Sappers in Gibraltar at this point. They have within them units from the Royal Canadian Engineers, who have slightly better equipment than their British counterparts. And essentially, they blast the rock from the north face of the rock to get all the fill. It's all pushed into the sea, and then through a mixture of night shift, day shift, they come in and pretty much in 50-meter sections, tarmac this area out into the sea to allow Gibraltar to become that staging post between North Africa and Britain. Because whilst Malta would have done this, they were currently under a rather large siege of their own, unable to do so. So Gibraltar became even more strategically important with the use of air assets than it did before. Now, post-war years, there is a number of engineering efforts that do happen as well. We have the creation of the King's Lines Oil Fuel Depot, so a facility able to hold upwards of 270,000 meters cubed of fuel, so a significant undertaking there. We have the Mole's End Way, so finished in 1968. This was the last bit of tunnelling that the Sappers have done so far on the rock. And then the Cow Bay Hole Power Station, built and operated by the Sappers, again in the late 60s, early 70s. I imagine some of you might even know that bloke, I don't know. But we have a large mixture of projects going on throughout the site through the decades to come. 1972, we have the freedom of the city of Gibraltar, so we'll be replicating this photo later on today. And then we also have the exercise shot construction project. So there's a number of external units that many of you may well have been on, who based in the UK, come out here, do a bit of construction, and see the sights of Gibraltar. And then the present day. So it's worth noting the MOD footprint has shrunk significantly. You know, from what was 15 companies at one point, we have 6. And well, 5 in Sapper PIDs, and then our chief of staff happens to be a Sapper, which is great. So we've got 6 blokes on the rock doing Sapper stuff. However, through the use of the contractors that we have, we're still doing a lot of projects. We've a £3 million refurbishment of the HQ building. We've redone the rock armour on the South Mole, and we're looking to do a massive accommodation block / training area on the Buffadera training area. So there's still a lot of projects in the barrel waiting to be delivered. And this is all because of what's happening in the future. So integrated review, Gibraltar, after 2 decades of no investment, becoming austere forward operating base, we flip reversed, and now we are looking to be one of these global hubs and a base of operations going forward. So with that, we need to upgrade some of our port infrastructure to be able to get the Navy's brand new aircraft carriers in. You know, they docked here last year, but at ruinous expense to the local economy, so we're trying to be able to get them in ourselves. The fuel facility, decommissioned in 2007, we want to reinstate an element of that to be able to fuel said ships. And then we need to get over the strategic ape. The apes on the top of the rock keep trashing our communications networks, and so we need to do something about that. So there is a lot of investment planned to go forward. So the contribution of the Corps has not yet finished by any stretch of the imagination. That's just the final note I will give. So taking you from the very earliest times where we took control of Gibraltar, 1704, all the way to now and in the future, the Sappers have always been intrinsically linked with Gibraltar, and the history of the Corps reflects that. And I do hope that going into the future, it will be as glorious as it has been in the past. Thank you. That's been me. Thank you.